What is the autism spectrum? To understand this term, we should think of other spectrums we've seen before. One that most people recognize is the color spectrum of visible light. To describe it simply, we say there are 7 basic colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Yet when we look more closely, we see that these 7 do not sufficiently differentiate all 300 plus wavelengths on the visible light spectrum. So we have additional color names for certain wavelengths in between. Near the intersection of green and yellow, for example, we have lime and chartreuse. But as we look even closer, we see a point where the human eye cannot distinguish where green ends and yellow begins. Some might call this color yellow-green, but the technical name for it is wavelength 556 nanometers. Since that number doesn't make sense to most people, this color usually gets called yellow or green. The autism spectrum works the same way. There are names separating different parts of it because there are real relevant differences between different categories of autistic people. Yet certain people cannot be accurately categorized as having either HFA or nonverbal autism. They fit somewhere in between. Partly because of this, the authors of the DSM have eliminated many of these distinctions and now say all of us simply have the very vague diagnosis autism spectrum disorder. Using their logic, because green and yellow don't sufficiently distinguish certain colors, should we eliminate all specificity and just call every wavelength part of the color spectrum? Does it matter if the ocean is blue or red? Does it make a difference if the sun is red or blue? Does it make a difference if a child has Fragile X syndrome or Asperger's syndrome? Technically, this last term no longer exists, but that doesn't mean the important differences in both their abilities and needs have gone away. The animal kingdom also requires difficult differentiation between its many similar families, but just because the monotremes and marsupials are related does not mean that a platypus is the same thing as a kangaroo, and it especially doesn't mean a platypus is the same as a bat, even though they're both part of the spectrum of mammals. Asperger's syndrome is not the same as other forms of autism despite the DSM's claims. People with Fragile X syndrome have very specific needs and abilities not only as individuals but also as a group who have certain things in common, not only IQ. Just as people with Asperger's syndrome also have very specific needs and abilities not only between but within their group identity. Ignoring these things leads to a form of abusive neglect. The DSM made a huge step in the wrong direction in 2013, and we need to not only undo it but further increase specificity within the autism spectrum based on underlying cause and uniting or distinguishing characteristics.